second reading this morning is from the Gospel of John in the 18th chapter. I'm going to read 28. I'm actually going to stop sooner than it's printed in the bulletin. It's 28 to 38. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to sit with Jesus and Pilate. Maybe stand is a better way to say it. They have this an extended conversation, and it's recorded in John's Gospel. The other Gospels make either allusions to the conversation or share briefer snippets, so to speak. But John extends the conversation quite a bit, and it's a really rich and it's a really full conversation, and I want to dig into it. I want us to look at what was going on with Pilate and why Jesus acted the way he did and why Pilate did what he did. So today we'll read 28 to 38, and next week we'll pick up the continuation of the conversation that will take us into chapter 19. Listen for a word from our Lord. Then, this is after Jesus had been arrested, then they took Jesus from Caiaphas, the chief priest, to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They, the Jews themselves, didn't enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him for yourselves. Judge him according to your own laws." The Jews replied, "We're not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death that he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied to Jesus, "I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and your chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate looks at him and asked, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice," Jesus says, and Pilate asks him, "What is truth?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The season of Lent is a time of self-examination. It's a time to look inside ourselves and to wonder what God is calling us to do as we move forward, to come to terms with what we've done as we look to what could be next. I thought about that all week long as I was preparing for this particular homily, and I realized something reading this story, this conversation between Pilate and Jesus, and I realized something. Pilate never got to tell his side of the story. John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, even the Apostle Paul, and anybody else, no one called Pilate and said, "Can we get a clarifying comment? You want to quote us? Maybe a response to what we've written about you?" And so I thought, let's give Pilate the opportunity to speak this morning, because I think there's more there than what is just simply written. It is easiest, I believe, if we assume that we are Pilate. This morning we're going to try to do that so we can better understand what went on from his point of view. So I want you to switch gears really quickly with me. You are now a military commander in one of the most important outposts of the Roman Empire. You were trained for this type of leadership. You come from a long line of military men. Your father and your grandfather, they were teaching you the ways of the sword from the day you could remember your first memory. They taught you over and over at dinner, show off your military might. Make sure your soldiers put down any rebellion with force so it deters anyone else from doing anything against the empire. Also, remember to keep your political connections happy. This last one is key. You learned over time around the dinner table, but also when you went to the Roman military academy, that peace is more of a political process than a military one. So you keep the religious and the political leaders close. You know that strong-arming them around the boardroom is better than in public. You give them little victories so they think they're in charge, but you also remind them who's really in charge. As we continue to assume we're Pilate, we have to come to another truth. You don't want to be in Jerusalem. No one does. No Roman wants to be there. It's on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. It is hot. It is dusty. It is always seeming to be on the verge of war. This little parcel of land has been a hotbed of fighting for 2,000 years, and you don't know this now, but it will continue to be a hotbed of fighting for 2,000 more years. Whoever's in charge of Israel is always worried about invading armies. You're on the edge of the empire. You must hold the barriers. That's just outside the city walls. Inside the city walls, you're the governor of this city. It's an adopted city. And there are potential political nightmares that make modern-day Washington, D.C. look like Mayberry. Jerusalem is where the Jewish leaders live. They have their own rules, they have their own laws, they govern themselves, and they care deeply about the temple. It's in the center of the city. It is the most sacred building in all of their history, and you're supposed to govern them when they don't always want to be governed. You are protected from most of this, though, as the governor of Jerusalem. You're Roman. You have a safe place to sleep. You have your wife by your side. She tells you constantly, you're not traveling the world, you're not riding on a horse all day, you're not sleeping in a tent. You have a home, you have good food, you can ring a little bell and something is brought to you. You've learned, because this is not your first post, you've learned how to deal with everyone important. And you're beginning to sense what we all sense over the history of humanity. If you do your job well, you'll soon be promoted and you can leave this dusty city behind. All your plans change, though, one morning. When you're woken up much earlier than you wanted to be woken up. You pride yourself on the fact that sleep is important if you're going to rule well, but someone is knocking at your door. It's urgent, sir, the guard says. It's the Jewish leaders. They have a man they want you to convict. You dress yourself, you give your wife a kiss, and you tell her, I'll be back in a minute to have some coffee. This shouldn't take long. It never takes long, right? You were taught how to rule, be decisive, stand by your decisions, keep the empire intact. When you walk outside, your eyes adjust to the rising sunlight, and you see a face you've never seen, but one you've heard 100 times. Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, the guard tells you his name, is standing before you. Suddenly, you realize this is kind of important, and Caiaphas is here, so are the Jewish leaders. Why else would they wake you up so early? They know you like sleep. The Jewish leaders are upset with this Jesus character because he's making claims about being a king, and to be honest, you probably think they're just a little annoyed that he's more popular than they are. Just make your own decisions, you tell them. But you listen first because you've got deals in place with them. Remember, you're a political leader. You know how to work the back boardrooms. You know that they wield a lot of power with their people, so you keep the Jewish leadership happy. You know your job is easier if they're happy. You are taught to keep the peace using your political genius. This is when you realize, guys, this is not my problem. You have your own laws. You have a book of them. They're called the Torah. Go to the temple. Deal with Jesus in your own way, you say, and you turn to leave. But they push you. Oh, people always push leaders. They like to push those in power a little bit to see how far they can get before they cross the line of no return. They remind you, hey, the Passover's coming up the next day. There are going to be thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jews are going to be descending upon Jerusalem, and you got to keep the peace, Pilate. Then you remember something about the tradition of releasing a prisoner, and you say to them, look, there's Jesus, he's a Jew, I'll release him to you. You are thinking politically, but it doesn't work. They don't want this Jesus character. This is too much. You're not really sure what's going on. You don't know what to do with him, but you know you're better one-on-one than you are in public, so you say, Jesus, follow me into my headquarters. What you have no idea is that this conversation will change you and the world forever. You don't know that the moment you lay your eyes on Jesus and come face to face with him, he will change you just by being in his presence. You don't know that this isn't a man or a character or a person from a town. This is God's Son. This is God himself, and he has power you only wish you had. But how could you know? He wields power in a way that you don't understand. He uses his words, his actions, his love. He doesn't use a sword, and you don't know what to do without a sword. He wields his power with love and not bloodshed. And you just look at him and he looks so innocent and vulnerable, so you keep talking. You have to figure out something to do. You're the governor. Maybe you can strike a deal and save his life. Maybe you can make the Jewish people happy too. You know that nothing gets a crowd riled up like a Jew being killed by the Romans, and you want to keep the peace, especially at Passover. There's going to be so many more Jewish people in the cities. Your military leaders have told you we're already stretched thin. People are working overtime. They're hungry, Pilate. Don't push us. You think to yourself, all right, let's get this over with quickly. So you get to the point, you look Jesus in the eye and you say, are you the king of the Jews? And then something happens. Usually the fact that you're brought into the headquarters of the Roman governor makes people really nervous. They start to shake. You can see sweat pouring down their faces. They become anxious and worried, and they'll tell you whatever you want to hear just so they can get out of there as quickly as possible, save their own skin. But Jesus looks at you and then he questions you. Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Jesus asks you. Is he really questioning me? Does he know who I am? You say to yourself, I have the power to kill him, and yet he's coming at me. Not only that, but he doesn't seem anxious or worried. He's not worried about his own life. And so you keep talking to him. I'm not a Jew, am I? You tell him. Your own nation, your chief priests, they've handed you over to me. What have you done? Just tell me what you've done, you ask. You want to know what's got the chief priest so upset. You've never seen him this upset. This is when something else happens within you. This is getting interesting. You, as Pilate, are starting to change. Jesus replies that he's not from this world, and his kingdom is not from this world, and he has no desire to battle you with military might. This is different. You weren't trained for intellectual battle. You can wield a sword really well. But you want to keep talking. When you come face to face with Jesus, you are changed. You can't put your finger on it, but you know that you want to know more. You want to be in this man's presence. But there's a mob outside. And you have to make a decision. You have to decide this man's fate who is standing before you, and you need a reason for why you're doing what you're doing. So you are a king, you say to Jesus. You just told me you're king of this world, another world. What world? But he doesn't answer. At least he doesn't answer in the way that helps you make a decision. He says that others say he's a king, but he came into this world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth, he says, listens to my voice. And you can't help but blurting out what immediately comes to mind. What is truth? And it hangs there. You didn't know you wanted to know what truth is. You didn't know that you are a conflicted person who questions whether someone is innocent and should die or not. You were trained to make quick decisions and not worry about the consequences. You were taught to be decisive based on what is right and wrong, but you don't know what's right or wrong in this situation. You didn't know that you were putting yourself into the ultimate predicament when you agreed to get up out of bed and to look Jesus in the eyes and have a conversation. You didn't know that he would become more than a set of eyes or a person that the Jews were trying to get rid of. You didn't know that because of this conversation, you will soon be memorialized by Christians throughout all of time and throughout all the world who will recite your name on a weekly basis when we say, suffered under Pontius Pilate. At least they used your formal name, you might say later in life. This is when I realized how similar I am to Pilate. I say I never would have done what he did. I never would have caused Jesus to suffer. I never would have ultimately put him to death. But I've never stood where Pilate stood. What we come to realize when we read this story is that Pilate is infamous because he was an unlucky governor in the Roman army who was stationed in Jerusalem when Jesus was an adult. Preachers like me say we shouldn't act like Pilate, even though he was just doing the job he was trained to do. And here is another piece of truth. If Pilate didn't have this conversation, if he didn't make Jesus suffer, and ultimately if he was not the one who said, put him to death, in just a little bit we would be using some other Roman governor's name each week in the Apostles' Creed. But I always come back to, he's the one who killed my Lord. He could have let him go. He could have defied the Jewish and Roman leaders. He could have been a great Hollywood movie and the mob that was gathered outside his home. He could have said no, but he didn't. And then I realized that that's too easy. It's too easy because it makes Jesus this character who has no agency. It's too easy because it pins everything on one person, although I do like that because it means that I'm not to blame and no one else is to blame, especially our ancestors. It means that we can breathe a little easier and have different thoughts than worrying about whether or not we helped or our ancestors helped usher Jesus into Pilate's hands. The truth is, we really wouldn't care about Pilate, but Jesus made us care. Because Jesus showed up at his doorstep early one morning and knocked. And everything changed. Now we're talking about Pilate. And maybe that's part of God's plan. Maybe Pilate was in the right place at the right time. Maybe it's easy to think Pilate had all the control because then he's culpable and no one else is. But the truth is, Pilate wanted to know what truth is. He just didn't understand that it was standing right in front of him. We may not like it, but we're more like Pilate than we wish to admit. We want to know what the truth is, and more often than not, we're not always aware that it's standing right in front of us. But make no mistake, God keeps showing up. God always has. It's usually early in the morning, right at your doorstep, knocking. Thanks be to God. Amen.